Once again, good morning, everybody. My name is Hádley Gamble. I am Chief International Anchor for IMI and a contributing editor here at Semaphore. It's wonderful to be joined by this gentleman, Finance Minister of Norway, but also the former Secretary General of NATO. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Okay, first question. In your mind, is the NATO alliance at risk?
Well, at least now I need to answer in a diplomatic way. So the reality is that the NATO alliance faces some severe problems and challenges. There is no way to hide that, because everyone that reads a newspaper or watches TV will be able to see that there are some serious disagreements between allies, and in particular between some European allies and the United States. Having said that, I think we also need to remember that NATO has faced many crises before. Starting with the Suez crisis in the 1950s, or when France actually left the military cooperation within NATO in the 60s, or the Iraq War. So we have been able to overcome disagreements before, and I really hope and believe that we can do that again. It's not given, it's not written in stone that we'll manage, but it's for us to take a responsibility to maximize the likelihood for that to happen. And I think the important message there is that the main criticism from the United States and from President Trump has not been against NATO. It has been against NATO allies not investing enough in NATO. And that has changed. European allies have really stepped up. There are now several European allies, like Poland, the Baltic countries, my own country, Norway. We are spending a larger share of GDP on defense than the United States. So things have changed and continue to move in the right direction. That's the first reason I believe that NATO can prevail. The second reason is that I believe in interests, that matters. And for the United States, it is good to have a strong NATO is good for Europe, that's obvious. But a strong NATO is also good for the United States. The United States is big, it's 25% of global economy. But together with NATO allies, we are 50% of the global economy and 50% of the world's military might. So it makes the United States safer to have friends and allies, something that Russia and China doesn't have at all. If I can add one more thing, and then you can interrupt me. This is not
he knows me well.
Yeah, this is not only about resources, money. We are pouring in more resources and more money, more forces, more readiness, more capabilities. That's important. But it's also about geography. I'm from Norway. We have a land border with Russia. Just on the other side of that land border, we have the Kola Peninsula. That's the place in the world with the highest concentration of nuclear weapons. Submarines, long-range bombers, missiles. Those nuclear capabilities are not aimed at Norway or Oslo. They are aimed at Washington, New York, Chicago, the United States. And we track them, we monitor them, we hand over daily intelligence to the United States. So we have early warning, so we track the submarines and actually help with homeland defense, just the fact that we have Norwegian presence so close to those nuclear capabilities. That makes you safer, so NATO is good for the United States.
What happens if the president pulls out of NATO?
Then we are all less safe. Europe is less safe, and the US is less
What about the cost? Because European defense
well,
countries are not prepared.
Then of course, first of all, I don't believe that will happen. But of course, I'm not issuing guarantees. No one can issue that kind of guarantees. But the reason why I believe it won't happen is that partly Europeans are addressing the main complaint, and that we didn't spend enough, which was right, but it's changing. And second, because I think that the US will realize that it makes them less safe, or you less safe. And the purpose of NATO is actually not to wage a war. The purpose of NATO is to prevent the war. By sending a clear message to any potential adversary that an attack on one will trigger a response from all, and as long as that is credible, there will be no attack.
So is the president wrong to call out NATO for not actively getting involved in the Strait of Hormuz?
But he's not wrong in saying that NATO has not contributed actively to that military operation. But if you want NATO to contribute, then at least you have to sit down with NATO allies, as you did after 9/11. And that was the first and only time we have triggered Article 5. And hundreds of thousands of European soldiers actually been deployed in Afghanistan. 1,000 have been killed in the military operation that was a direct response to an attack on the United States. That was a NATO operation. The Iran war there were never any issue. It was never, you cannot expect us just to be there without any consultations, any discussions in NATO before you take the decision to launch the attack. Second, Of course, many European allies question whether this is the best way of getting rid of the regime in Iran and the best way of degrading or also stop their nuclear programs.
Is it?
Well, I supported the alternative strategy, and that's also the Norwegian position, and that is sanctions, diplomatic, economic pressure, helped us to reach one deal to limit their nuclear programs some years ago. And I am uncertain whether the campaign we see today actually will lead to a better situation for all the people in Iran. We all condemn what the regime in Iran does against their people. They have killed thousands of people, and we all condemn their nuclear program. The question is only, how do we maximize the likelihood for achieve what we all want? And it's not obvious that what's going on now is the best way of achieving that.
In your mind, what role should NATO have in the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I think that NATO could, but that's some way down the road. We could play a role in ensuring free passage. I think there's a meeting again on Friday with European allies as a European initiative to look into what can European allies contribute, what kind of capabilities, what can we do to help safe passage open up the Strait of Hormuz. But I think what European allies are not ready to do is to be directly involved in an armed conflict against Iran.
Is Mark Rutte getting it right in his strategy with President Trump? Because he's getting criticism both ways.
Well, Mark Rutte is a close friend. We were prime ministers together for several years. When I was prime minister of Norway, he was prime minister of the Netherlands. Then we worked together when I was Secretary General of NATO for 10 years. And he has the same difficult task as I had when I was Secretary General, that is to keep this alliance together. It's a big family, 32 allies. So
but would you have called the US president Big Daddy?
But he faces a different challenge, and I will not be kind of sitting there and commenting on everything my successor does.
You're a good friend.
And a good friend, but I would just recognize that he has a very difficult and important task. I had my words, my language. I remember my favorite line was that the clear message from President Trump on defense spending is having an impact. And that was correct, and I still believe it. That you can agree or disagree with Trump on many issues, but the clear message that Europeans have to spend more had an impact. And President Trump liked that, and it helped. So I think it's important finding some lines and then stick to them, and that's what I did. And then I have great confidence in Mark Rutte that he's doing this as good as possible in a difficult situation.
Tell me this, Vladimir Putin. We're not talking about him that much these days. In your mind, how is Russia today in terms of their economic health and also in terms of, frankly, the fight against Ukraine?
Well, Russia today and Vladimir Putin is very different than we expect them to be back in 1999 or 2000 when he became president. And I met President Putin the first time in August 2001. I was a newly elected Prime Minister of Norway. He was a newly elected President of Russia, and for many years I worked closely with him. We opened up actually the border between Russia and Norway for visa-free travel. We had big energy projects together, and we all believed that Russia would move in a more democratic way, and NATO, not only Norway, but also NATO established something called the NATO-Russia Council, so we all believed that this was a kind of beginning of a new era. At some stage that started to change, particularly in 2008 when Russia went into Georgia. And then, of course, after 2014, when they annexed Crimea and went into Eastern Donbass just after that. Fundamentally, I think that for Russia, it has been a big strategic mistake and defeat to go into Ukraine. Because their main goal, and they expressed that in a letter to NATO, to me, back in 2022, that the main goal was to have less NATO. They're getting the exact opposite. They wanted us to withdraw our forces from the eastern part of the alliance. NATO has deployed more forces in the eastern part of the alliance than ever before. In Romania, in Poland, the Baltic countries, as a direct response of that invasion. They wanted us to guarantee no further NATO enlargement. Finland and Sweden have become members of NATO as a direct consequence of the alliance. And with Finland in, NATO's border with Russia has doubled. and the Finns know how to fight a war. So to have them on board is good. Also the Swedes, of course. Yeah. I like the Swedes, but we were under Swedish rule for 100 years. We got our independence from Sweden in 1905. So for Norwegians, we like the Swedes, but we say that it's not, for instance, sports, the most important thing is not to win, but to beat the Swedes. So,
Tell me this, if you look back and you've got the benefit of hindsight, obviously, in your years as Secretary General, in your mind, what was the great mistake that the West made in underestimating Vladimir Putin?
It was a mistake that we too slowly recognized that we could not trust Russia, too slowly recognized that that requires that we have to invest more in defense, so we were too slow. And had we had more, also stronger defense forces and also supported Ukraine earlier. Again,
well, I remember we did an interview just ahead of the war, and the Ukrainian foreign minister at that time, Dmytro Kuleba, said, we need to pre-sanction Russia. They are coming for us. And you and I talked about it.
Yeah.
And we didn't do it.
No, but I can't remember exactly what I said, but I hope that I said something like we need to support Ukraine, because the reality is that if NATO allies have supported Ukraine from 2014, when Russia first went in, and armed them and equipped them, then at least Ukraine would have been in a much stronger position today. And maybe they have actually been able to deter a Russian invasion. Because Russia has been trying to take Ukraine since 2014, full-scale invasion in 2022, and still they don't control Donbass. It's a huge failure for them. And now they're losing like 1,000, perhaps a bit more soldiers per day. And that's approaching now the level of the number of soldiers they're able to recruit. This has now turned into a war of attrition. Everyone thought that Russia will win a war of attrition. That's not obvious. It may actually be Ukraine that is winning this war of attrition, partly because they have, they have the advantage of defense. They have advanced technology when it comes to drones. In the beginning, 80% of the casualties were caused by artillery. Now, close to 90 or 80-90% of the casualties are caused by drones. And Ukraine, partly helped by the United States, but also by Norway, have developed a drone technology which goes far beyond what other NATO allies have been able to. So put this together, Russia really struggles on the front line. They have not been able to gain any territory the last year, despite all these casualties, 1,000 days approximately, and the Russian economy struggles.
And yet higher oil prices are good for Russia.
Yeah, the higher oil prices, of course, helps them a bit. That's also a dilemma with the war against...
and I've visited Russia several times since the start of the war. The economy is ticking over.
What do you mean?
Ticking over.
Yeah, yes. For instance, the interest rate is close to 16%. And then the official that's the number we know. Then the official inflation rate is, according to them, 6%. If that's correct, they have extreme high real interest rates. I think it's more likely that the inflation is not 6%, it's much higher. Because they have a war economy, which is under heavy pressure. They have an enormous lack for workforce. They're sending many people to the front. Hundreds of thousands young men have left. And the war economy is taking such a toll on the rest of the economy, so they struggle on the front, in the economy. So if we continue to support Ukraine will actually prevail and prove that it was a big strategic mistake of Putin to invade Ukraine. And it's our responsibility to make sure that that happens. We support Ukraine, Norway. I hope that the US will continue to do the same.
Tell me this. Let's talk about the money before I let you go. Norway, biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. You're being hit from both sides because on one hand, higher oil prices, good for your sovereign wealth fund, but on the other hand, you're one of the 10 investors in US companies. Yeah. So anything that moves on the stock market impacts your network.
Yeah. So I am in that very strange position that most people move forward in their life. I have started to move backwards. I was Prime Minister for 10 years. Before that, I was Minister of Finance. And now I'm back in the position as Minister of Finance I had 30 years ago. That's a paradox, to be honest, but it works well for me, at least. One aspect I like with that is that the year I became Minister of Finance the first time, in 1996, at the beginning of that year, it was 0 in the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. The first installment was made in 1996. Today, it's more than $2 trillion US dollars, out of which half, actually 55%, is invested in the US, most of it in equity, meaning that the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund owns, on average, 1.5% of every US listed company, and we are among the 10 biggest owners in every listed US company. That's good for Norway because the US stock market have gone quite well. But of course, it also exposes for the risks you all have, we all see in the stock market. But I can just tell you that we plan to continue to be a big investor in US companies and to have roughly half of our investments there because the American stock market is so dynamic and reflects the strength of the US economy. But it makes us, of course, concerned when we see the consequences of the war in the Middle East with increased energy prices that can increase inflation, push down growth. And we have now the outlook from the IMF published this week, showing actually that there is a more uncertainty, but also risk for actually higher inflation, lower growth that will harm also equity markets in the coming months and years if this is the consequence of the war.
What do you think is the great risk in what's happening today in terms of China is watching?
Well, I think there are many risks and many opportunities. We all trade a lot with China, and that has benefited many of us. But there is a huge risk, and that is that we make ourselves too dependent on China and makes ourselves too vulnerable for coercion from China. And I sometimes use Russia as an example. Until the full-scale invasion, the majority of European governments meant that buying gas from Russia was a commercial decision with no political impact. It was a political decision because it made us vulnerable for coercion from Russia after full-scale invasion, where they stopped exporting gas to us to try to coerce us not supporting Ukraine. And we must not repeat the same mistake with China to be too dependent on rare earth minerals, strategic commodities, to hand over key technology to them that they can use against us or let them control key infrastructure in our countries. The big challenge is to find a balance between some trade, some economic engagement with China without overdoing it and being too dependent. And if there is any answer to that, I think that one answer is to develop our own sources, for instance, for rare earth minerals. And again, Norway will play its part in that effort. And
finally, sir, I'm talking about those risks. When you take a step back and look at what we've been through in the last several years, certainly since you and I have been doing these interviews, we had the global financial crisis, then we had COVID. Did we sleepwalk into another energy crisis?
To some extent, that I think we have done too little to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, not the United States and Norway, because we are net exporters, but the West in general is still too dependent on too few suppliers of fossil fuels energy. And also because I think there is a huge potential in different new renewables, partly for environmental reasons, but in the long run, I think also that will be the cheapest energy we can get, and also where we can have the domestic sources of energy that makes the West less dependent on sources from outside. I say this as a big oil and gas producer, so it's a bit paradox, but I believe that the West should be less dependent on fossil fuels for different reasons, and then Norway has to find something else to export than oil and gas.
You once told me that you wanted to be central bank governor of Norway, and I said, why? And you said, the Sovereign Wealth Fund.
Yes.
What do you want to do next?
I don't know. I've never been able to follow my plans. I was actually appointed as the governor of the Norwegian Central Bank, but then I had to decline that because I was asked to continue in NATO because of the full-scale invasion. When I was eager to become the central banker, then I didn't dream about becoming Minister of Finance again. So now I'm again responsible for the Sovereign Wealth Fund. That's fine. And then I don't know what I will do next, but something will happen, and normally it's something good.
The Munich Security Conference.
Sorry. Sorry. But that's not a full-time job. I will at some stage take over to be chair of the Munich Security Conference, which is an important platform for security dialogue, especially between the United States and Europe. Yes, so you'll find me there once.
Fantastic. Minister, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.